Good morning. I'm Father X, talking about how fathers can win their child custody case. In episodes 6, we're going to talk about my first day in family court and the domestic violence that happened in our home before court. Let's get to it. Why does this matter? The first day in family court is extremely important because temporary custody orders made on that day usually last a long time and can often end up becoming the permanent orders. And if you walk away from that first day in court as a non-custodial, alternate weekend parent, it makes your challenge so much greater to become a 50-50 or primary custodial parent. So I'll specifically give you strategies for that first day. However, for you to understand them, you have to understand why these strategies exist, what you're trying to accomplish, and what you're trying to fight against. If you can understand these underlying dynamics in court, it'll help you tailor my strategies to your specific situation. So in the next 3 episodes, I'm going to cover my personal story of what happened in my home in real life before the courts got involved. And then we'll talk about my first day in court, so you can see how disconnected court proceedings are from reality. And then I'll discuss the lessons I learned so you don't make the same mistakes I did. And my hope is that for your first day in court, you can do better than I did. For you to understand the train wreck that was my first day in court, you have to understand what happened before court. The difference between real life versus what happened in court is why I view family court as the land of fraud. In addition, I'm sharing my story because many of you guys experience what I experienced. I want you to know you're not alone. It's time we bring public attention to female domestic violence. As I tell you what happened in my home, recognize the domestic violence was one way. It wasn't mutual. And I'm not here to ask you to believe my story because I already proved my case in court against a gender-biased judge. I'm telling you this because you need to understand how the courts can act in cases where the mother is the perpetrator of domestic violence, like my case. Before I get into the story, please like, subscribe, and share. Also, if you find this information helpful and you want to support this channel, please donate via my YouTube channel's About page. You can donate via PayPal. Here's a summary timeline of my relationship with my son's mother. I also want you to see how I tell my story in a chronological order. When you testify in court, this method will help the judge understand the sequence of events in your home and the cause and effect of various actions by each parent. We dated about 4 months and then she became pregnant. We were not married. When we learned she was pregnant, we had tough conversations because our relationship was rocky at that same time. But we decided to move in together when she was 4 months pregnant so we could raise our child together. Before we moved in together, she was exhibiting signs of anger management problems, constantly yelling and berating me for hours at a time, several days a week. She would often yell at me about future crimes against her that I was going to commit, which was kind of crazy. She often accused me that I was going to cheat on her or abandon her, even though my actions showed I was trying to bring us together to raise our child. But I decided to move in with her because the alternative was that I would have a baby mama out there in the world with my child, that she could always move out of state or get another boyfriend, and then I would probably almost never see my child. And I wanted to raise my child. When she was 7 months pregnant, we had our first major violent episode where she threw a bottle at my head, barely missing. And then she ran to the kitchen and grabbed a large knife in a fit of rage, threatening to end the pregnancy by killing our unborn child with that knife. Then she put the knife down and assaulted me by throwing 10 to 15 punches at my head in a fit of rage. It was insane that I had to stand there and block these punches from the pregnant mother of our child. Yes, women can commit domestic violence too. Anybody who tells you otherwise is a bigot or a liar. Shortly after that assault, we started to see a psychologist to address the mother's issues of violence and anger. This psychologist heard from both of us, and we also had one-on-one conversations with her. After a couple of months, the psychologist recognized the problem was the mother's violence and mental health issues. Around the time our son was born, the psychologist told me the mother had borderline personality disorder. And if you know what that is, you recognize how destructive borderlines can be. It's kind of hopeless. I knew the relationship wasn't sustainable because her anger management problems and violence were too destructive for me to live with. This kind of violence was never part of my life. But the mother always thought it was normal behavior and never showed remorse for her actions. She often yelled at me that I was supposed to love her, even if she was hitting me and insulting me. I spoke with our therapist, alone, shortly after our son was born, and I talked to her about the idea of splitting up from the mother and going to court for custody of our son. This first therapist told me courts favor the mother when the child is this young. She told me if I wanted to have meaningful custody, I had to live with the mother, endure all of the abuse, and continue raising our son together. And then I could go to court after several years to maybe get custody after I established that I was an active parent in our son's life. I knew that I should leave his mother, but my son was the biggest priority of my life. I had no interest in abandoning him or moving out and leaving him behind. Also, the mother's family was in Florida, where she was raised. Both before and after childbirth, the mother often threatened me that she would move to Florida if I didn't marry her or if I left her. If she moved to Florida, I wouldn't see my son at all without making cross-country trips. When our son was 4 months old, we had our second major act of violence, where the mother assaulted me again and threw 10 to 15 punches and kicks, most of which I blocked. It was again a one-sided assault. At that point, it became apparent that violence was going to be the standard in this household. When I called the police that day, they told me it didn't matter what I told them because they only believed mothers, and they could have me arrested just based on what she said. They told me to leave the house for the night, even though I was the one who called 911 for help. Shortly after that incident, I met with a family lawyer. He advised me that courts prefer to give custody to the mother, even though both parents are supposed to have equal rights. He advised me that what you want to do in the very first appearance in court is to produce so much bad evidence that it scares the judge into not giving primary custody to the mother. He said one thing that judges fear most is that they would give custody to the mother and then they end up in the headlines of the New York Times because the mother did some abusive thing to the child. Also, when we moved in together, she was still working, and I chose not to work because I could live off of savings for a year. I wanted to be a stay-at-home dad to start our child's life. When our son was born, I was a stay-at-home dad until he was 7 months old when I returned to work. She took 3 months of maternity leave where she was co-parenting with me. And when she went back to work, I was the one who was at home feeding and taking care of our boy. I was feeding him at midnight and 3 a.m. I was the one who soothed him when he was crying because she was often not able to because of her frantic state of mind. I was with him at doctor's appointments. This wasn't a case where the mother did the child care and the dad was off doing something else. My son and I were attached at the hip ever since he was born. After this second assault, I had to decide whether or not to go to court. I chose not to because by this point I had learned mothers get custody 90% of the time. This was based on what the lawyer and psychologist told me, as well as my own research. I didn't want to fight in an arena that was biased against me. I also calculated that because the mother was violent and had anger management problems and was suicidal, maybe she only had a 60% chance of winning custody. Even with her issues, the cards would still be stacked against me. During the more than 1 year I lived with the mother, she would often fly into fits of rage and yell at me for 3 to 6 hours at a time, for about 4 days a week on average. There was no way to turn her off. If I argued back at her, it just added hours to the argument. If I wanted to take a break by walking outside, she would get angry, saying I was abandoning her by not sitting there and taking her verbal assaults. I often had to sit there while she spewed her venom and wait until she tired herself out at midnight, and then we could go to bed. It was a living nightmare. She also made several suicidal threats, so I knew she had mental health issues, and this was far beyond the case of postpartum depression. We had stopped seeing our first psychologist when our son was 2 months old, because our health insurance coverage ended. When our son was about 5 months old, we started to see a couples counselor who was a pastor at a church. He used to be a clinical psychologist, but gave that up to become a pastor. So he was a counselor who was aware of mental health issues like bipolar and borderline personality disorder, even though he was not playing the role of a licensed practicing psychologist while meeting with us. We spoke to him one-on-one and as a couple. He also recognized the problem in the relationship was the mother's violence and anger management problems and her impulse control issues, like when she grabbed knives during arguments. The mother admitted to this behavior during our sessions. When my son was 8 months old, the mother assaulted me a third time, again throwing 10 or 15 punches and kicks. Once again, I called the police, and again, I was the one who left the house. There were incidents before this third attack where I felt I needed to call the police, but I didn't, because I knew they were useless in cases where the mother was the one committing domestic violence. But during this third major assault, she was too far out of control, so I had to call the police in an emergency. When our son was about 8 months old, we started seeing our third couples counselor, who was a currently practicing licensed therapist. We met her as a couple as well as one-on-one. After a few weeks, this psychologist also recognized the core problem was the mother's violence and anger management issues. This therapist told me during one-on-one meetings that she thought the mother had either bipolar disorder or borderline personality disorder. Either way, many of the symptoms are similar and involve violence, anger, and extreme mood swings. This therapist got really angry at the mother on one occasion and yelled at her, "You have to stop grabbing knives when you're in an argument." It was the therapist's way to try to hold the mother accountable for her actions. And I remember it well because later on, when court got involved, the courts did the exact opposite and never held the mother accountable for her actions, but rewarded the mother's violence. I know many of you guys are in a similar situation as I was, where the mother is physically assaulting you. I knew I couldn't assault the mother back. First, if she assaults me and I assault her, then we live in a household where it's okay for each person to assault the other one. And she could always say it's okay for her to hit me because I hit her too. Second, if I hit her back, I would go to jail regardless of whether or not she was assaulting me. I had figured out the police tolerate female domestic violence. So although I could have retaliated and beaten her to a pulp, all I really could do was block her punches and kicks and hold her down during her fits of rage to make her stop hitting me without hitting her back. I was living a nightmare. When our son was 8 months old, after the mother assaulted me for that third major assault, I prepared my petitions to go to court for custody and an order of protection. I had already engaged a new lawyer and we were going to file the petitions. However, the pastor who was counseling us advised me not to go to court and instead to give the mother an ultimatum to tell her I was going to court if she couldn't control herself and if she ever assaulted me again. In my mind, I still knew that if I went to court, there was a high likelihood I would lose because courts favor mothers. I recognized I really had no options here, so I didn't file the petitions. When the mother and I met with one of our counselors, I gave the mother an ultimatum and told her that if her nonsense didn't stop, I was going to family court. She heard it loud and clear. Now you're starting to see the dysfunction in the system. Society knows family court is gender biased, and this impacts the decisions we make. I had to stay in this dangerous situation because of the gender bias of the court and knowing the court wouldn't provide me relief. This may sound paranoid, except that when I went to court, the gender discrimination was obvious and real, so my fears were totally justified. When our son was 9 months old, his mother assaulted me yet again, with a standard series of punches and kicks in a fit of rage, while also grabbing a knife like a crazy person again. It's a bit of a long story, but I almost ended up with broken ribs. And the next morning, after a sleepless night thinking about this whole situation, I decided to move out. I didn't call the police that time because I already knew how useless they were when it came to issues of women committing domestic violence. The day after the mother's final assault on me, I moved out in an emergency situation for fear of my safety. I couldn't spend one more night in that house because I almost ended up with broken ribs that night, and I couldn't rely on the police for help. Unfortunately, as I was urgently moving out the next day, she left the house and she went to family court to file a petition for custody and an order of protection against me without my knowledge. She lied to the court, claiming she was the victim of my domestic violence. And then she went to the police a couple of hours later and filed a false police report. And that's when the family courts got involved. And that began my 40 months of hell. So now you know the backstory of what happened in real life. The next episode will discuss my first day in family court, which is extremely important because temporary orders usually last a long, long time. So buckle your seatbelts. These might be the darkest days of your life. They were for me. I'm making these educational videos to help you navigate this nightmare. If you subscribe, you can get updates when I post more videos. Thank you for liking, subscribing, and sharing with your friends who are in a similar situation. If you like, subscribe, and share, it'll also help the YouTube algorithm get this message out to more fathers in our position. And if you find this information helpful, please support this channel by donating via PayPal on my About page on YouTube.